Sean, thank you so much for doing this. This is Sean Kyler, someone who works for the Vera Institute, which is a national criminal justice reform organization that I have long admired and respected immensely. Sean himself is also a formerly incarcerated individual who started working for Vera very soon after his release. And we've sort of asked Sean to come and speak to some of the themes in the movie and as to when they're accurate, when they're not accurate, and also what we all hope on the filmmaking side and on in the legislative side and the nonprofit world that works on these issues daily, what an audience member might take away from this film. And Sean and I talked briefly yesterday, and really it's the character of Elsa that is obviously, for my money, the heart of this film. And I'm just, I guess maybe Sean, if you could give us a brief background of helping us to understand and unpack the tools or the lack of tools that someone like Elsa has as she re-enters the world after 16 years of incarceration.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for having me. I just want to add a little bit more to the introduction for your audience. I served 24 and a half years in New York State prisons. One for a crime that I'm still fighting my innocence for. I've also served 3 years on New York State parole. And so for some, I'm deemed an expert having the lived experience going through this process. And when I saw the film and I think about your question about the tools or the lack thereof tools that Elsa would have had re-entering, I think about my own re-entry and the re-entry process of those that I know who've done over a decade of incarceration time. And when we think about tools within the state, we have to think about them in two different frames, as mandatory programs and then voluntary programs. And when we talk about mandatory programs, we're talking about state required programs. And those would be things like an 8-week anger management course, where Elsa would have to have gone through a process of talking about the crime that she was convicted of, what led up to that crime, what happened after that crime, what would she have done differently. And then equally, there will be vocational training programs that would, in a sense, get her prepared for reentry back into society, as well as educational opportunities. As Elsa's a young woman in the film, it is presumed that she went to prison at a young age, and she would have not finished high school, so she would have to, by operation of law in the department, obtain her general education diploma, GED, and she would have to have a work program as well. And some of those work programs are menial work, mess hall work, cleaning up, porter work. Some of the higher tier jobs would be clerk jobs, but you would need some type of formal education for those degrees. So she would probably be locked out of those work environments without a GED. And so the other side to that is also voluntary programs, where these are programs that she would actually seek out on her own to be a part of. And some of them consist of, especially in the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, there will be a longer term support group that will really go more in depth about the nature of her crime, how she feels, and be more supportive in helping her transition past the initial shock of being in prison and work with her throughout her prison time. And then there's also working with the Children's Center at Bedford Hills. There's jobs there that would help her, deal with the trauma that she's faced, or, from her father, as well as the trauma of being in prison.
Did you, when you watched the film, did you see her as being well prepared for her reentry?
In a nutshell, no. And the reason why I say no, I would say that she didn't have a plan already when she came out to get a job. So when we enter the story as the viewer, we can see that she's can't get a job somewhere. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is some semblance of a lack of preparation prior to coming out. And this is, in a sense, where parole preparation projects and things of that nature would be helpful.
What is the condition of preparation programs, parole preparation, and then reentry programs in general in the New York State system, these right now, in your opinion?
Well, from the state side, parole preparation is non-existent. There is no program that is sponsored by New York State that will help an individual prepare for parole. Parole preparation work is given by outside entities who, in the nonprofit world, who have taken on this endeavor to help individuals get out of prison, especially within the last 5 to 7 years, when the numbers of people that were being released from parole was down to like 19-20%.
Wow.
And so there was a need to help individuals prepare, especially people who we consider as long-termers or lifers who have been incarcerated for 2 or more decades, could not get access to the information that they needed, did not know how to prepare for the parole board, did not know how to prepare for the technology that the parole board has now with the lack of face-to-face parole hearings, but being on a screen and talking to an individual just like Zoom.
Wow.
And so if one can think about where we are today in the pandemic and how we use Zoom and what we had to do to prepare, this would be the same culture shock that someone in prison who's never been experienced to this type of technology would have to go to a hearing to talk about their freedom. So it's just added trauma.
What are, besides parole preparation, and if you had a magic wand that you could wave over this prison system right now, what would be the things you would concentrate on in terms of funding and training?
If I can wave a magic wand for this issue of preparation for parole, I would make it funded by the state. I would fund the parole preparation projects in New York, like Parole Preparation Project, like the Fordham Law School, like Cornell Parole Initiative, like the Brooklyn Law School Initiative. I would give them funding to make sure that they were resourced enough to make sure that they had enough staff to help everyone that needs a lawyer or needs assistance going to the parole board, because it can be a traumatic experience.
Mm-hmm. In watching Elsa's character as she gets out of prison, can you give us some context of what she might have experienced in prison that makes her such a raw, sort of not always highly disciplined person as she navigates her reentry? What did she go through in prison?
Well, when I watched Elsa's character and thought about her life in prison, what her life may have been in prison, to the woman that she is as she enters the screen, I think about the lack of opportunity that she may have had. When I heard her talk about how she had to pay for education and her family couldn't help her because her mom was disabled, there's another son, the lack of funds. I think about the phone calls that she could not have had because of the cost of phone calls, and how that ability not to connect with her family affected her mental state. The idea of her not being able to go to school and pay for schooling, if that was the case for her, as she said in the movie, and couldn't afford it, those opportunities to connect with outside individual civilians and have that connection and interaction to really talk and learn about what is going on the other side of the wall, that personal interaction, that level of care that comes in with people being treated as a human. These are things that you get when you talk to people that are outside volunteers that are coming in. They have your level of humanity in the forefront of their mind, and they treat you like a human being, as opposed to treating you like a person who is convicted of a crime and are cast off in society.
That's amazing to hear. It seems so true. I mean, also you think about so many people who become perpetrators of some sort or find themselves entangled in the system are victims of trauma themselves, and certainly Elsa is in this movie. Is New York State or in general state and prison systems equipped to deal with that sort of the trauma that comes with being the victim of child molestation?
So I want to be clear that it's not a one size fits all answer, because of the 50 some odd prisons in New York State. The level of treatment is different at different facilities. From the state side, I would say that they're not equipped to deal with the trauma. Their curriculums do not address the trauma. What happens is remember I said earlier about the voluntary and mandatory programs. That trauma is addressed in the voluntary programs. There's programs like the long-termers lifers program, where they are ran by incarcerated individuals who have themselves gone through trauma and worked through that trauma. And so they are so near and dear to the problem that they have a vested interest in making sure that they help those that are coming in with these types of traumas. And so a lot of that work is really done by the men and women who are already incarcerated and who take a serious investment into the person and helping that person become whole, so that when they return to society, they are better than the person that they were when they came in.
And not to make excuses for Elsa alone, because I want to talk about her agency, but I can imagine, and when I was writing this, I certainly tried to imagine how easy it must be for someone like her, who comes in fairly angry into the system, to slip through the holes and not even find the opportunities that there are for trauma treatment.
I would say yes. And then I would also add to the idea of her slipping through the cracks, that in a sense that because she was a young girl coming into the system, there, especially in Bedford Hills, there are women in Bedford Hills who are motherly figures in the system, and their intent is to make sure that young women that come into the system are not traumatized even more than they are normally traumatized. And they try to ease that process of helping them navigate the system and kind of find their way. And when we look at incarceration over the long haul, we kind of think of it in three phases. The entry phase, where you're really trying to find yourself because this is a new experience. And that may take anywhere from 1 to 5 years for you to really find yourself. And then there's that middle ground where you found yourself and you're figuring out, okay, I can do whatever this sentence is. And then that last phase where you're really focused in on your plans for release. There's a saying that we have for those of us who have been incarcerated, and it's reentry starts on the day after you enter prison.
Wow.
And that is a model that we preach and practice.
And in seeing Elsa in the film, did you feel that she was going through that process when you saw her when she got out? Do you feel like she had been through that process properly?
When I saw Elsa in the film, I immediately realized that she had gone through some of the process. I felt like she wasn't wholeheartedly into the process. And I think that may have been because of the way the system treats women, especially in this process. And when we think about how the system treats women, especially women who have suffered trauma at the hands of men, it seems as if the system protects the abuser as opposed to the person who is abused. For years, women have fought in New York State to get a law enacted that recognizes that trauma, that recognizes that abuse. And so when I look at Elsa throughout the movie, it, to me, both times she was victimized by the system had the same fact pattern.
That's interesting. I mean, just on that note, we see her in the course of this movie desperate not to go back. Can you tell us a little bit of what might have been going? I know it's not easy one to one, but what might have been going through her mind as she sees her opportunities for success on the outside slipping away?
When I think about how Elsa would have felt being in the position that she was in and her fear of going back, I think about the things that she had going on at the time. In the film, she talks about the job that she has that was going so well, that she was doing so well with. The viewers will recognize and remember how she talked about her mom and how her mom was disabled and how she felt good to be able to help her mom. Equally, how she felt good to be able to help her brother go to college by having this job and being able to help him. And then to think that all of that would be snatched away from her because of another perpetrator victimizing her and her protecting herself in her own mind was traumatic for her, was clearly traumatic for her. And I think that that in itself was why she took the steps that she had taken in order to kind of, in her mind, think that she could get away from not having to go back to a traumatic place in prison.
That's incredible. I mean, it's so funny. It's not funny. I think there is a pattern in our society where we who have not been lucky enough not to have been incarcerated struggle with deep empathy for those who have found themselves by the grace of God, or not, inside versus out, versus the notion of agency and responsibility to you have responsibility. And I think it's a naive thing that we try to reckon with, like, when they shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have done that. And how did you, watching this, and I'm sure you have dealt with that notion on a way deeper level. How did you feel about watching it with Elsa and about the idea of responsibility versus victimhood?
So thinking about Elsa's agency and comparing that with taking responsibility, and I think about that in two phases. And the latter phase being the parole process, but initially thinking about her time spent in prison. When you go to prison, you lose your agency to do a lot of things. To do things like as simple as turn off a light. You lose that agency to turn on a TV, to do things that you would normally do that gave you some sense of independence is largely taken away from you. And you do things to try to bring back that agency when you're in your cell, in places that you can control. But think about it in the sense that the state tells you when you can eat. So you cook in your cell, or you make food in yourself, to have some type of agency and some type of independence, to have some type of normalcy in your life. And so I thought about my own experiences there, where for years I wasn't even able to open a window in a cell. The idea of not being able to get fresh air when I wanted fresh air for over a decade. And so I thought about that, and it brought me back to that time. And then when I think about her agency thereafter in the parole process, to lose that again after being free and doing something that was not, like, she didn't make a choice in that moment. She reacted to a trauma that was unaddressed for 16 years. And she responded in the way that she knew how to respond to protect herself. But the system doesn't see her as a victim because she's convicted of a crime. And this crime in the system eyes is just another step, and you're not capable of functioning in society. And that is not looking at her as a person, because it was a situation that was beyond her control. And again, we as a society, especially in the system, we protect the men as opposed to protecting the women.
It's really, yeah, it really strikes me as true. Can you just speak there quickly to the idea of what it's like to find a job, as a convicted felon coming out? You are exception, I imagine, to the rule of finding a good job very quickly. Is it as hard as we think it is, and as we always hear it is? I imagine it is, but what do you think?
So the process of reentry and finding sustainable work is not necessarily hard with proper preparation prior to your release. I would first say that I'm not an exception. I'm not an exception.
Okay.
I'm not an anomaly. What I am is a person who knew that there was life after prison, and I had to prepare for that life after prison. And so I took advantage of all the opportunities that would allow me to succeed post-incarceration. All of my jobs that I've ever had in prison all went towards some type of advocacy work. I was able to get access to computers. And so I prepped for post-release. When you think about, there's work, and it is hard. And I shouldn't say it's not hard, but it is hard. To have a conviction, you have to find where your conviction does not hinder you. And in the nonprofit world, convictions do not hinder you in terms of work, because the experience that you have is invaluable to nonprofit organizations, especially doing criminal justice work and immigration work, because we are closest to the problem and we have that experience.
That's amazing. That's amazing to hear. I think I just want to ask one more question. About bail reform, which this movie doesn't deal with so much. It's a controversial topic in New York. How should we, New Yorkers, be thinking about it? Because you hear, arguments on both sides. I have defense lawyers who do a lot of pro bono good work, and even they worry that sometimes they went too far. But I don't know what to think. What are your opinions?
So yes, the issue of bail reform is very controversial in New York since its enactment. But when we strip away the partisan rhetoric, what's left is the data and what the data shows. And what the data shows is that bail reform has actually succeeded beyond our imagination. The purpose of bail reform was twofold, was to decrease the number of people that were incarcerated, number one, and number two, to protect public safety. And so when we talk about public safety, what we know is that the communities that have the most resources have the safest communities. The communities that are over-policed and lack resources have the least amount of public safety. And when we look at the numbers in the court system from the Office of Court Administration, we know that the amount of people that come through the system are for misdemeanor crimes. At least 2 to 1 to the amount of people that come through the system for a felony. And so when we think about that, we think about the large amount of people are, especially in New York City, the maximum prison time for a misdemeanor is 1 year at a maximum. And largely, most of those are nonviolent crimes. And so when bail reform went into effect, we know that in New York State, the rearrest rates were 19% in 2019. They went up to 22% in 2020, then they dropped back down to 20% in 2021. So there was no significant change with the enactment of bail reform in New York City. And the same is true across New York State. But what we didn't do as we didn't fund pretrial services. And what we know from the data today is that when people are given opportunities and they're told that, hey, you have a court date coming up, a notification, people return to court for their day in court. The idea that we are locking people up who are presumed to be innocent until their day in court, but we're letting others out based upon whether they can afford a bail or not, is constitutionally ridiculous.
That was very convincing. I'm in. Sean, this is amazing. Is there anything else that you want to say about the movie, about anything, just unsolicited?
I appreciate the film. As we spoke before, I am very cognizant and conscious of the perception of people in the media portraying people who are incarcerated. And for your viewers and for those that have, again, have viewed the film, I really want them to get the connection as to why Elsa acted the way she acted during the course of the movie, that she was not manipulative or conniving just because she was trained or taught or that's her personality. Her honest fear of returning back to prison made her desperate. And in that desperation, she used the tools that she learned in prison. And we see her arrested development in prison going at a young age, because we know you learn and you develop through experiences and the outcomes of those experiences. And in prison, there's very few experiences that will give you the type of lessons that are transferable outside of that prison setting. And it's a lot of that is learned based upon jobs that you have in the prison, where you may act as a liaison for the prison population to the administration. So you're learning tools that you can use that are transferable. And so a lot of the upper echelon jobs, you can get the things that you need to help you transition back into society. And so when we look at Elsa's character, she's not the stereotype that is being portrayed about men and women that are incarcerated.
That's so good, important for us to hear, and I thank you for seeing that through the film, even if it's not always enunciated fully. But I certainly, as a filmmaker, want that message to come across, that she was not given a full set of tools there, and that she was not lucky enough to get into that sort of skill set building area, because I think it happens. My work in prisons has also sort of validated there are good things happening in prisons, but there are a lot of people who don't get those opportunities. So, Sean, this has been amazing. Thank you. Seriously, it's very meaningful to me on a lot of levels, and I quite appreciate you taking the time out of a busy day.
Thank you.